I'm on mute. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Distinguishing NMOSD from MS. We are so excited to have everybody here today, especially as we celebrate NMOSD and MS Awareness Month. Today, we'll be exploring the differences between NMOSD and MS. Those are kind of and then we are aiming to provide not only clarity, but also awareness into both conditions. We'll be hearing from an expert in neurology as well as 2 patient advocates. And let's go over a few housekeeping rules before we get started. Okay, let's make our online gathering as smooth and enjoyable as possible. Here are a few digital housekeeping rules. Participate actively. You guys should all be able to see a chat function on the bottom of the screen. Ask questions, leave comments. Your voice matters. Use the chat wisely. And any tech troubles, kind of just flag us in the chat, or you can email at, oh, is that cut off? Just signal us in the chat. We'll get you some help. And first up, we have Dr. Jakai Nolan. Dr. Nolan is a board-certified neurologist and MS thriver. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nolan with star emojis in the chat as she kicks off our first session.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is having a good day thus far. Again, I'm Dr. Jakai Nolan. Just to give you a little bit about myself before we start talking a little bit. As she stated, I am a MS thriver. I love that term. I was diagnosed with MS in 2009. Interesting for me, growing up, one of those doctors who always wanted to be a doctor. I thought I wanted to be a pediatrician, and then got introduced to neurology or neuroscience when I was in high school. I did a summer program, so decided to major in neuroscience in college. And the idea at that time was to get a dual degree. So my doctorate and my doctorate degree, as well as a PhD, so I could do research. Then time came to apply for med school, and I had some imposter syndrome. I was scared of getting turned away. I also had an interest in public health. So to give myself a little bit more time, I decided to come back home to Atlanta. I'm originally from Georgia. Born in California, but I left at 6 months. So I'm from Georgia. I won't claim California. But I came back home and went to Emory for grad school. And on the very first day of grad school, I woke up and I had blurry vision in my left eye. Now, growing up, I had always been told that if I saw any floaters or anything at my eye, that I was at a higher risk for retinal detachment. So if I had any changes in my vision like that, I needed to immediately get to the doctor's office. So that's what I did. Fast forward, I'll never forget being at the specific doctor, ophthalmologist. It was a retina specialist. And I'll never forget sitting there. I was at one end of the hallway. And then there were 2 doctors at the other end of the hallway, and they were kind of talking back and forth to each other, looking over at me. Then I heard the term MS, or maybe it was multiple sclerosis. I'm not sure. But either way, at that time, I had no idea what that was. I had never heard of MS. And of course, it freaked me out. So went and looked it up, and officially kind of got diagnosed on September 17th of 2009. And then I just threw myself into everything MS, and ended up majoring in not majoring, but I specialized in neurology. So I did my residency in neurology. And just because of my particular interests, decided to do a fellowship further in neuroimmunology, specifically with multiple sclerosis. So here I am today with this and able to, have this discussion with you guys today. So let's go ahead and move straight into it. Prior to getting further into our talk, I want to go over some key terms that I think that we all need to understand. So MS is multiple sclerosis. You may see the term NMO or NMOSD, and that stands for Neuromyelitis Optica Spectrum Disorder, or NMO Neuromyelitis Optica. Now, autoimmune disorder, both of these conditions are autoimmune disorders. So this is a condition where your body's immune system basically attacks itself. So it attacks your healthy body tissue. It attacks the healthy cells by mistake. We don't know kind of what triggers this to happen, but this is kind of the base that happens with an autoimmune condition. Another term for us to know is the central nervous system. So you may see CNS in different places. And again, that stands for central nervous system. And this basically consists of the brain. And within that, we also do include the optic nerve as well as the spinal cord. Anything outside of that, we call the peripheral nervous system. So that's like the nerves in your arms and your legs. And then this last term, this is important specifically for NMO, is AQP4 IgG. So basically, this is aquaporin for IgG antibodies, and this is the specific antibody that's the hallmark for NMO. So moving right into everything, just to kind of briefly, let's go over what is multiple sclerosis. So MS, as we talked about earlier, is an autoimmune condition. It's a slowly progressive condition that attacks that central nervous system. So the brain, the optic nerves, your spinal cord. And what exactly it does is there's an antibody that specifically attacks what we call the myelin, or the wrapping around your nerve cells. So you can kind of think of myelin like the wrapping around a cord. And this antibody or something, I won't say antibody, but the immune system itself attacks this wrapping, and it causes lesions or patches within the brain and the spinal cord. What happens is when the myelin, what it does is it allows the nerve cells to communicate smoothly. So it allows that connection to go through as quickly as possible. Similar as what, again, with the wrapping around a wire. So whenever there are holes in this myelin or holes in the wire, this communication is impaired. So if you can think about, like, if you have a cell phone charger and that cell phone charger has gotten old, and it's to the point where whenever you need to charge your phone, you have to turn your phone on the right side and you have to bend the cord in a certain way in order to get your phone to charge. If you just lay it straight out flat, your phone won't charge. So a similar thing with MS and how the myelin around your nerve cells works a little bit. So because your body can attack, or the immune system can attack areas within the central nervous system, it can lead to a wide array of symptoms that we can see with MS. So this can include weakness or clumsiness. So if there's a lesion within the brain, in a particular part of the brain that controls muscle movements, or in the spinal cord. If also we can see stiffness and gait disturbances, so foot drop. Gait disturbances can also be from sensory disturbances. So if someone develops numbness or tingling in their feet, it may be a little bit more difficult for them to walk, because that communication between your feet and the brain is gone, and the brain doesn't necessarily know what the feet are doing. So that can cause imbalance, or just, again, weakness in the legs. We can also have numbness and tingling in the arms, or just anywhere in the body. Visual disturbances, this is also a big thing. Most of the time we see this is going to be from optic neuritis, which we'll talk a little bit more about. Optic neuritis is essentially where there's inflammation of the optic nerve, and that can cause visual changes. Also with MS, we can see more mental disturbances. So cog fog or brain fog is a common thing. We can see emotional lability, depression, anxiety. Now, these things can inherently be a part of MS just because of the changes and all the inflammation going on in the brain, but also just with, a diagnosis of any kind of condition, a chronic disease, that in itself also can lead to depression and anxiety. And then fatigue. Fatigue is our invisible symptom that, it can be hard to explain to people, but it's a huge thing that we can see with MS. So the symptoms, again, can be broad, but where in this does NMOSD fit? So NMO, again, is also another autoimmune condition. For the longest, it was believed that NMO and MS actually represented one disease that just kind of had variable ways that it showed up in an individual and variable ways that it was expressed. So looking back in retrospect, the actual first clinical description of NMO was by Devick and Galt in 1894. So you may see, if you do research about NMO or you have NMO, you may see that it's also sometimes called Devick's disease, or Devick's syndrome. And this is why. So in 1894, these two gentlemen, they described 16 patients who had a loss of vision in one or both eyes. But these patients also developed severe spastic or kind of muscle spasms or cramps, as well as weakness in their limbs. They had a loss of sensation, and they even had a loss of bladder control. So the significance and the severity of this was a little bit different from what was seen in MS patients at the time. And then MS is not as prominent or prevalent, I'll say, in the Asian community. So studies of MS in Asia years ago revealed that at the time, thinking that these patients had MS, but these individuals' MS seem to just have more frequent and severe attacks of the optic nerves or the spinal cord, and these individuals seem to show more rapid progression. So there became an idea of, does MS just kind of have different varying degrees of how the disease presents, or could there be something else going on? And so doing further research, we were actually looking at the actual lesions. So you have, you can get kind of the brain lesions, of course, not in a person that is alive, but, in someone who has passed, getting a biopsy of their brain and taking a look at the actual lesions. When they looked at the lesions under a microscope of an individual with MS and an individual with NMO, those lesions looked a little bit different. There were different immune pathways that seemed to be prominent and that led to the lesion there. And then they also noticed that in these patients that seem to have a little bit different symptoms from those with your traditional MS, these lesions seem to predominantly target the optic nerves and the spinal cord. There weren't as many lesions in the brain, and the lesions that were in the brain were in areas that were not typical for what was typically seen for MS, or again, the lesion may have looked just a little bit different. So then they also found that, there seemed to be in these patients a co-occurrence of optic nerve symptoms, so optic neuritis, reoccurring optic disease, as well as transverse myelitis, and maybe not as much as the additional symptoms that we may see with MS. So at the time, this suggested that NMO may be a clinical syndrome on its own rather than a single disease. And so then in 2002, doing more research, they actually found a protein that seemed to be affiliated with NMO, and it seemed to be the target for it. In 2004, there was a specific autoantibody that was actually found. So the interesting thing with this, and I always find this to be interesting, is whenever we as providers, as doctors, whenever we kind of do antibody testing, if we send to facilities like maybe Mayo Clinic, they may run a huge panel of different things looking for antibodies. And if something pops up that is not familiar or, has never been seen before, they kind of store that to the side. And then as they start developing more or seeing more and more of these antibodies, they kind of take a look back and say, okay, where did these antibodies come from? What symptoms were these patients having? And then that's how we're able to, with time, find new antibodies for different conditions. So that's what happened in 2004 with NMO. And then in 2005, they discovered the specific antibody, so the aquaporin P4 or AQP4 that we talked about earlier. And then this is the specific thing that we can see with NMO. And that is what kind of confirmed NMO or NMOSD as a distinct clinical condition or clinical disorder. The aquaporin P4 antibody they found was widely expressed throughout the central nervous system, and oddly enough, it had high expressions in the optic nerves and the spinal cord. And then you'll see kind of these terms down here: superoptic nucleus of hypothalamus, periventricular structures, aeropostrema. Nothing that you need to know or remember, but these are other areas within the brain where we can typically see lesions associated with NMO and not necessarily with MS. But those areas of the brain also have high levels of this antibody. And we can also see it in other non-neural tissues throughout the body. Again, letting us think that NMO is more of a spectrum disorder versus just one thing. So jumping right into the epidemiology. So with NMO, similar to MS, there is a female predominance. So about 70 to 90% of individuals with MO are females. Now, tend to do have a slightly higher prominence of females with NMO than we see with MS, but at the end of the day, MS also is highly prevalent in females. There does not seem to be a gender predilection in children who have it. Age of onset, this is also something that kind of differentiates NMO from MS. So the age of onset is a little bit older in NMO than what we typically see with MS. Now, of course, there are outliers and, this is not definite, but most commonly we tend to see or diagnose, I'll say, NMO and those between the ages of 40 and 50. Here I have written down 35 to 45 years. When we're looking at at multiple sclerosis, the age of onset oftentimes is younger. So we typically kind of have that range from 20 to 50, but more commonly in like 20 and 30-year-olds where we may kind of get that diagnosis. Children and elderly, so kind of the outliers, this accounts for about 18% of those living with NMO. And about 80% of individuals, if not higher, with NMO are positive for that antibody, so that aquaporin P4 antibody. So with MS, we do not have an antibody or anything that we know of yet that is specifically associated or related to MS. A thing that, and I don't have this written down on the slide, but one thing, and some of you may have required, if you have MS, may have required a spinal tap, or even, if you have NMO, had a spinal tap or a lumbar puncture. And with that, we're looking for a specific protein called oligoclonal bands, or OCBs. We see this in about 95% of individuals living with MS. This is something that we do not typically see in those with NMO. Again, just kind of the underlying process of what happens with the condition is different. So we don't see that protein that is more related to myelin wrapping around the cells. Now, jumping back to NMO, most cases are sporadic. It could be 3% kind of familial risk, so increased risk. We see the same thing with MS, where there's if you have an individual living with MS or a first-degree relative, there's about a 3% increased risk of someone else in the family developing MS or any other kind of autoimmune condition. Having one autoimmune condition puts an individual as well as other people in the family at a risk of having other types of autoimmune conditions. So things that include rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, type 1 diabetes, sarcoidosis, different things like that. And then there have been some thoughts of some genetic susceptibility and an idea if this could be why we may see higher numbers of NMO in the Black population or Asian population. Is there some underlying kind of genetic thing that increases that risk? We haven't identified a specific gene, but these genes, again, that I have listed here just kind of show that there might be an increased risk there. So as far as for additional information, prevalence is a term that we use for the existing cases of a condition. So the prevalence of NMO is, we can see 0.5 to 10 per 100,000 individuals. Incidence is new disease or new diagnoses that we can have. And that can be 0.2 to 4 per 1 million. In the United States, I recently saw, and I should have made sure that I got an updated number, but I saw where there are about maybe 4,000 individuals living with NMO or diagnosed, I'll say diagnosed with NMO in the United States. This number, could be higher at this time. We know when it comes to multiple sclerosis in regards to the incidence or new cases, and we're seeing that in new individuals being diagnosed, about 45% of those people are Black females that are being diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. So the more thought I guess there's more interest coming into, these autoimmune conditions, NMO, MS. There's another one called MOG antibody syndrome. that could be that are showing that maybe, you know, there's a predilection or something more interesting things with Black females. And we can kind of come on and let's talk a little bit more about the symptoms here. So I do want to see if we can have a little bit of time for questions. So transverse myelitis. So transverse myelitis is essentially where you can have inflammation in the spinal cord. We can see this both with multiple sclerosis as well as NMO. With NMO, we can see where there are spasms, weaknesses in the limbs, sensation loss, paralysis, loss of bladder, and bowel function. And something, again, similar things that we can see with multiple sclerosis. The thing that differentiates the transverse myelitis or inflammation of the spinal cord is with MS, we tend to see smaller lesions within the spinal cord. And those lesions tend to be located on the outer part of the spinal cord. With NMO, those lesions tend to be larger or longer, so they kind of go across multiple of the vertebrae. And then those lesions tend to be in the middle portion of the spinal cord. This can lead to kind of maybe why we can see a broader array of symptoms as far as for kind of association of weakness with the with sensory changes and things of that nature, and that does not resolve as quickly as what we may see with MS. And it's all based on the location. So that's one distinction between NMO and MS with transverse myelitis. Another thing that we also see is optic neuritis. This is a common thing, and especially in the Black population, those with both NMO and optic neuritis, NMO and MS, for a lot of people, the first symptom may be optic neuritis or a combination of the optic neuritis with the transverse myelitis. With NMO, optic neuritis oftentimes can lead to blindness. So the significance or severity of the optic neuritis is a little bit different. And this is because more of that optic nerve tends to be involved with NMO. And we've defined optic neuritis as kind of painful vision loss. So essentially what happens is the optic nerve becomes inflamed. And if you can think about it, the optic nerve is kind of attached to the back of your eye. And if it's inflamed or irritated, as you move your eyes side to side or up or down, it's tugging on that optic nerve, and that can be kind of painful. So that's where the pain comes in when we have optic neuritis. Now, with NMO, we can see where optic neuritis may occur in both eyes at one time, or what we call bilateral optic neuritis, or reoccurring episodes of optic neuritis. Now, we can see reoccurring episodes of optic neuritis in MS, but it's not as common. And most of the time, when an individual with MS has optic neuritis, it only occurs in one eye. So with me, when I had optic neuritis, it was only in my left eye. I did not have any involvement with my right eye. So that's kind of a distinction between optic neuritis and NMO and MS. And the last thing to point out as far as for a distinction with symptoms is this is something that we do not typically see with multiple sclerosis. And it's all because of how we were talking about before, where those lesions are. They're in different areas of the brain that are not as classic for what we can see in NMS. In NMO, there's a condition called erythropoiesis syndrome, where an individual can present with hiccups, nausea, vomiting, and all of this is intractable or basically hard to control, and nothing really that you can do to get rid of it until kind of that inflammation calms down. And this is, again, specifically from lesions that are in particular areas within the brain and the brainstem itself that we don't typically see with MS. Also, lesions in NMO in the brain tend to be a little bit larger than what we see with MS. We don't typically see as many lesions within the brain in NMO as what we may see with NMS. So the next big thing is treatment. So this is a huge thing and a major reason why it's so important to have a proper diagnosis, and why it's important to be able to, from a patient standpoint, as well as from a provider, a neurologist standpoint, to be able to distinguish between the two. Because there are some treatments for multiple sclerosis that can exacerbate or worsen NMO activity. So we want to make sure that we have the proper diagnosis so that we're not starting on these medications and possibly making someone's disease a little bit worse. So some of the medications that have been shown in the past to worsen NMO, medications for MS that can worsen NMO, might not be first-line medications that are used anymore for the treatment of MS, but some medications are. So one in particular is natalizumab. So this is a monthly infusion that a lot of individuals with MS are taking, but this can worsen NMO. So we want to make sure that that diagnosis is correct. So there is a break of treatment into acute treatment as well as kind of more chronic treatment. So this is another important topic. So very similar to what we see with MS, we treat acute attacks or immediate attacks with steroids, more frequently IV steroids, or sometimes kind of high dose steroids, oral pills, but a lot of times that it makes a lot of pills that you might have to take per day. So giving through the IV is kind of the preferred route. Now, for instance, if we have optic neuritis associated with NMO, we may not see where there's a complete improvement in those symptoms when given the steroids, and we may need to move on to additional things such as plasma exchange or Plex. We've actually found that when using, moving on to these other treatments for acute onset of symptoms with NMO, the response or improvement in the symptoms is a little bit better with things like plasma exchange versus just using steroids alone. NMO left untreated has a high risk for relapse. So a different thing between NMO and MS is, as we talked about in the beginning, is considered kind of a progressive condition. So the disability and progression that someone sees can happen even though someone may not present with an actual clinical attack, or we may not see changes in the brain. When someone is not on any kind of treatment, there is still underlying inflammation that can be going on that can lead to kind of progressive disability over time. With NMO, it's not necessarily a progressive condition in the sense that it just kind of progressively gets worse with time. The disability that we see with NMO is more associated with each individual attack. And if someone has a clinical attack where, they may have symptoms in their legs, or again, kind of symptoms with their vision and some vision loss. It's not that attack will necessarily get worse over time, but it's the accumulation of the attacks over time that can build up the disability. So it's very important that we use immunosuppressive therapy to kind of stop those attacks or stop those relapses with NMO. Now, there's some oral medications that kind of help to suppress the immune system, but it's a very exciting time with NMO and MS, of course, but with NMO, where we now actually have medications specifically for NMO. Previously, even like 10 years ago, we were only using medications that were off-label, medications that we used in multiple conditions like MS or rheumatoid arthritis. We were using those for NMO. Work very well for some people, but maybe not as well for others. But now for those who are positive, or what we call seropositive for that antibody, the aquaporin P4, we have 3 IV infusion therapies that are available to help reduce the risk of relapse in those with NMO. So exciting times where we're seeing a lot of individuals who are having good responses with treatment, where they're not having kind of continuous relapses. And the whole idea here is to save vision, to prevent the disability, keep someone off of a walker or out of a wheelchair. So what do we kind of do from here? We find that there is an under-recognized burden of MS in the U.S. Black community. So I kind of talked a little bit before about it's kind of a more recent finding of that maybe about 45% of newly diagnosed MS cases are in Black women. We do know that NMO is more prominent in the Black community as well as the Asian community. So this is a recognized burden, and a reason why it's so important to make sure that we have proper education not only for us as patients, individuals, but also for loved ones, family members, those in the community, neurologists, as well as other family doctors, so that we know if someone presents with a symptom, we want to be able to correctly get or quickly get to the correct diagnosis. So spreading this information, education, peer support is important. Also, appropriate counseling, assessment, and accessibility to therapy is also important. I think the production of culturally competent videos is a huge thing. Even to this day, a lot of videos and things that I see with NMO, I'm not seeing as many Black women or even Black men that are being represented in these videos, and definitely with multiple sclerosis. But these are things that are changing, and organizations like We're Ill are helping to make these changes here. I'm also having appropriate media coverage. So I want to see our faces on these commercials on TV speaking about these different medications or drugs, helping to slow down progression or prevent relapses with NMO and MS. And then a big thing that any kind of lecture or meeting that you go to, you'll hear us talk about increasing diversity in clinical trials. I won't go into as much detail here today because this can be another topic on its own, but it's really important to make sure that we show up and are available for different clinical trials. It doesn't necessarily have to be a clinical trial for a drug, but signing up for a registry, just so that our information is out there, so that we are accounted for, and things can be used with the development of different programs and different medications coming out. So that was a quick rundown of multiple sclerosis and NMO. I did try and spend a little bit more time talking about NMO and the things that distinguish it from multiple sclerosis. But I think we may have some time for a few questions here. All righty. So I'm just going to kind of come up and go into the Q&A here, and let's see here. One attending said, is NMO becoming more common in Blacks? Is NMO more likely to occur if an Asian person and Black person have a child? This is a great question. I don't think that it's necessarily becoming more common in Blacks. I think that this is something that we're recognizing more, and we are recognizing more, and I think it's being tested more in Black individuals versus saying, okay, your vision changes are related to something else, or automatically assuming that it is MS. We're testing, knowing to test for these different things. As far as for is it more likely to occur if an Asian person and Black person have a child, I'll be honest with you, I don't know how to properly answer that question. I don't know. It's the whole genetic thing, and if there's actual gene and different things like that, that's we don't know quite as much about that. But I do just think just in the specifically if someone has NMO and then they have a child, that child is about at a 3% increased risk of having NMO or MS or any whatever autoimmune condition there is. Another good question I see here is, which is quicker to diagnose, NMO or MS? I will say that a lot of times NMO can be delayed because it oftentimes presents like MS. And so someone may just kind of come and have, their only symptom may be optic neuritis. We know that this is a classical thing that we can see with multiple sclerosis. And if that individual just happens to have lesions in the brain, then it may be assumed that this is MS. This is why I think it's really important, even within my community as a neurologist, why we understand kind of what the lesions and stuff look like in NMO versus MS, so that if we look at this, we can say, hey, this lesion location is not quite as classic for what I would expect to see with MS. Maybe I should be looking for other things. Another important thing that we can see also is that sometimes getting this antibody testing, it might be negative, and it's important sometimes if we have a high suspicion that we repeat the testing. If the testing is done with what we call an ELISA, that's not as sensitive for getting a positive test. So oftentimes we want to make sure that it's a cell-based assay, which is a lot more sensitive for a positive test coming back. So just see here, just making sure, do we have time for a couple more questions, or should we maybe go ahead and move on, and then we can always come back and answer additional questions at the end? Let's see. All right. Just kind of looking through here. So these are some really great questions here. So what I think I will do is we'll go ahead and move on. And we have some awesome presentations coming up with, they'll be, what am I trying to say? I'm sorry. I am having brain fog, guys. MS, it's real. It's real. They'll be introduced. We have an amazing NMO advocate as well as an amazing MS advocate here with us.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Nolan. I had brain farts pretty much throughout my whole welcome message. Thank you for sharing your story in the presentation. It was super informative. For our first patient advocate, we have Ashley Ratcliff Lundy. Ashley is the MS advocate and director of communications for We Are Ill. Please join me in welcoming Ashley with fire emojis in the chat.
People seen it, but they just don't know.
What I told you, Cutter.
People seen it, but they just don't know. People seen it, but they just don't know.
Huh?
People,
Let's go.
People seen it, but they just don't know. People seen it, but they just don't know. Come on, baby, let the good time roll.
I'm fresh off the block. The hustler just returned. I devote these niggas, now they call me Big Worm. I'm the shit, according to the streets. The town without gift will make Memphis bleak. But I don't toss up rock signs and diamonds, but I might toss an every head hole like I'm saying.
Baby, let the good time roll.
Let's do it. I'm right back at him. I'm Memphis. I know you feel hesitant, but I'm so positive they couldn't see me in the negative. Not today, no sir. They say life is a bitch. Yeah, I know her. When you see her, tell that bitch to holler. Cause I'm too fucking white t-shirt to live blue collar.
Baby, let the good time
About dollars. Let's go.
People seen it, but they just don't know. People seen it, but they just don't know. People seen it, but they just don't know.
Hello, everyone. So excited to be here. I'm Ashley Ratcliff Lundy, and I live with MS. So that video that you saw was a little synopsis of my diagnosis journey, but I'll go over my diagnosis, life after diagnosis, some of the symptoms I currently live with, and how I manage my MS. So to start, my whole life had been healthy. I never had any really serious health conditions. I fractured my wrist snowboarding. That was about it. But one day in 2017, I was photographing an event for my job. I used to work at Snapchat, and I was on my feet for probably 5 hours taking photos. And then when I got home, my foot was numb and it was tingling, and I was just like, oh, I just overdid it. I was standing too long. And then like the next day, I couldn't keep my sandal on my foot. I had slides and I would walk my dog and I couldn't keep my sandal on my foot. I'm like, that's weird. Maybe I just need to like, give it a rest, have a seat, take it easy. And then it just got progressively worse. So I went to see my primary care doctor, and she referred me to a podiatrist because my foot, my toes were, I couldn't wiggle my toes and I couldn't keep my shoe on. So I went to the podiatrist. He x-rayed me. Nothing was broken. He was of the opinion that I had like nerve damage. And so he referred me to a chiropractor. And then the chiropractor did tests on me, and he came to the conclusion that I had a herniated disc in my L4, L5 spine. So I was under treatment for the herniated disc. I did a couple of EMG tests, which I don't know if you've all endured that. It is the worst. It's like where they stick a needle in your whatever part of your body is affected, and they send electric pulses to determine like your nerves response to it. It's like basically felt like I was being fried alive. So I did multiple of those, and everything came back normal. And I was in physical therapy for said herniated disc. And I would feel great after my sessions. I would do the homework, my stretches. I had a TENS unit that would like, simulate my nerves. And everything would feel good after I left my session, but by the next time I had my appointment with my physical therapist, it would be like back from square one. And so I was in physical therapy for a couple of months, and my physical therapist was like, "Hey, I don't want to freak you out, but if this was a herniated disc, we would see some, improvement by now, and we haven't seen that. So you really need to get a second opinion. You should see a neurologist, a neurosurgeon, like literally anyone you can see to can like give you some clues as to what might be happening with you." So I went to get a second opinion. So the first appointment that I could find, or the next available one I could get, was with a neurosurgeon. So I was having, at this time, I was still having checkups with my chiropractor. And so I told him, "Hey, I'm getting a second opinion, just FYI." And he got mad, which I thought was really weird. He was just like, "Well, they're not going to tell you, they're going to just tell you if you need surgery on your back. And we know you don't need surgery. So you're like wasting your time." And he made me feel really stupid. And so I canceled my appointment. And then shortly after, I was like, "Well, wait a minute, like he's not the one who's dealing with what I'm dealing with. So I'm going to advocate for myself and make that appointment and get answers." And sure enough, when I saw the neurosurgeon, he was like, "Herniated disc where? Like the way you're walking, it doesn't indicate anything is wrong with your spine." So he did more tests on me. I had a MRI of my thoracic spine, my upper spine, and it showed lesions. And so in his report, it said, it's highly suspicious of a demyelinating disease. And I'm like, "What does demyelinating mean?" And he said, "It could be multiple sclerosis. I don't want to scare you. We need to get more tests." So I was referred to my neurologist for a brain MRI. It showed lesions on my brain. And then just to make sure the diagnosis was correct, I had a lumbar puncture, spinal tap. Actually, the worse than the EMG because it was very painful, the aftermath of it. Um, and then it revealed that I had multiple sclerosis. So on March 9th, 2018, I was officially diagnosed with relapsing remitting MS. It took me about 6 months to get diagnosed, which I feel lucky in a sense because I've heard stories of people being taking years for them to be diagnosed. Admittedly, it was hard for me to come to grips that I was living with a disease, for which there's not yet a cure. I entered into a period of depression and hopelessness, but thankfully my faith and my family gave me, encouraged me that my life isn't over. And once my health kind of rebound from that initial relapse and my foot drop got better, I began to get out of the, the weeds of it all and saw that my life isn't over. I can still follow my dreams and do what I want. Like I can still achieve my goals. So after diagnosis, I started on a disease modifying therapy. I am on an injectable that I take 3 times a week. It's been effective. Thankfully, I haven't had any new lesions or active lesions since then. So in a sense, my MS is in remission. Um, but the way that I maintain, my health is, taking the DMT, but also adopting a more healthy lifestyle. I work out with my personal trainer once a week. I ride my Peloton bike. I do what's in my power to, live a healthy life. And throughout my whole journey, when I was after I was diagnosed, people would find out that I was living with MS, and they would like their sister or their cousin or their niece would be diagnosed, and they would always ask me if I wanted to, if I could, share some things with them or just talk with them because it's such a shock. And I would always say yes. And so I began to realize like I could help more people if I wrote a book. I'm a writer by trade. I used to be a journalist in print and, newspapers, magazines, that whole thing. So I wrote Jesus Years, my self-help memoir, in December 2020. It became a bestseller on Amazon in 2021. And then on the anniversary of the book's publication, I released the audiobook that I narrated. And then I started in the video you saw, I was doing like Walk a Mess. So I've been fundraising for a cure since 2019. And then I found community with We Are Ill. Like Dr. Nolan said, we need more representation. And I didn't see that when I would get like the brochures for the DMTs or even looking at the MS Society's website. So I'm so glad that I found We Are Ill and I became a part of the community. I joined the Facebook group and, participated in the virtual meetups. And Victoria asked me if I wanted to join the team, and I'm so grateful that she has. I feel blessed to be a part of a team that's really helping move the needle and help Black women with MS feel represented. For me, onto symptoms, I have brain fog, fatigue, heat intolerance is really bad for me, especially during the summer, and that leads to more numbness and tingling. Hasn't led to a relapse yet, thank God. I suffer migraines on occasion, and something weird is like phantom itches where like my skin will be itching, but it like I can't pinpoint where it is. It's just a weird sensation. That's all I can describe it as. And then how I manage my MS is to continue to take my DMT. I, take my vitamins, vitamin D3. I work out with my trainer weekly. I ride my Peloton. I talk to my therapist bi-weekly, and I have a wellness coach that I talk to every week that helps me keep on track with my personal goals. One of the goals that has come to life, since my journey is I started my business. It's called Poppy and Monarch, and it's designed to help people with invisible illnesses like me feel represented. And so I have pins, a variety of wearables that help start conversations about chronic illness. So that's a little bit about my journey. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much for sharing your story, Ashley. That was really nice to see. Last but certainly not least, we are going to hear from Marion Jones. Marion is a NMOSD advocate and ambassador for the Sumaira Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Marion with clapping hand emojis in the chat.
Good morning, everybody. I'm sorry to let you down. I do not have a cool video. I'm gonna have to get with Ashley, offline, and she's gonna have to help me, kind of get things together on the video side of things. But I'm so excited to be on this call to share space with other thrivers and to certainly just share more information about my experience and my journey living with NMO. So I was diagnosed with neuromyelitis optica in November of 2020. And, even just, I'll go back a little bit before the diagnosis and say that in 2020, one would say I was living my best life. I had just gotten accepted into B school to pursue my MBA. So I got accepted into Boston University. I reside in Boston now. And I'd also just accepted a new job at a new company out of state. So I was in the process of relocating to Maryland, unbeknownst to many people, because I had just gotten the news and I was, going through the process of the acceptance with HR, substantial increase in pay. So I was really excited. But there was this one thing, this headache that I just could not shake in 2020. And I tried to self-medicate for about 6, 7, maybe 8 weeks. And eventually a friend of mine said, I think you need to go to the ER because having a lingering headache that felt like what a migraine would feel like, even though I had no history of migraines, was unusual. So I went into the ER, and some of the questions they asked, they wanted to know if I had a history of headaches. They wanted to know if my family had a history of headaches, and I answered no to both of those questions. And long story short, they prescribed some muscle relaxers, and they told me to take those in a couple of days. I should feel back to normal. So I did that. By day 2 of being on the muscle relaxers, I started to notice just weakness on the right side of my body. And I started to notice just a sluggish feel on the right side of my body. And so I was telling, the same friend, I said, I've got this, this weakness. It feels like, my arm is dragging. I can barely type with, my right hand. And he said, I think you need to go back into the ER. So I went back into the ER. And they, I started to tell them about these new symptoms that I had. And so they said that they needed to do an MRI. They did the MRI. And fortunately, there was a neurologist on staff who read my MRI scans. And he immediately said to me, I think you have NMO. I'm about 99% positive that you have NMO, but I want to do one more test just to confirm. And so earlier you heard information around the spinal tap. And so that was the process that I had to go through, getting the spinal tap. My spinal fluid came back positive for AQP4, the aquaporin that we talked about earlier. And so I received that diagnosis of NMO within about 72 hours. I always tell people that, if you were to be diagnosed with NMO or a rare disease, which NMO is still classified as a rare disease, Boston, Massachusetts is an ideal place to be diagnosed because of the level of, care that you receive in a place like Massachusetts, with the quality of neurologists and the medical history associated with the Commonwealth. However, I will say, now, when I look back in retrospect, I know that I started to present symptoms a couple of years prior to relocating out here. I remember going into a doctor's office in Tennessee, and the neurologist that saw me, who I don't believe was familiar with NMO, said to me, it's interesting because when I look at some of the reflexes you gave when I did this short neurological exam, because I went into the office because of back pain. I had severe back pain that I had been trying to shake for about 3 or 4 months. And she said, when I did the neurological test on you, it seems as if, your reflexes made me think of MS. She said, but when I look at your scans, it's not MS. And so it's interesting, when I hear and I learn more about MS versus NMO, and how NMO patients are often misdiagnosed with MS. And it's because of, the fact that NMO is still rare, and lots of doctors, when you mention NMO, it's something that's still new to them. So that's, the early onset symptoms, my ER diagnosis. After the diagnosis, I was admitted into the hospital, admitted into the ICU. And I had to go through this process of plasmapheresis. It's just a treatment where they basically, take your blood and they remove the antibodies that are attacking the body from the plasma. And so I went through that process. I was in the ICU for a couple of weeks, and then I was dismissed from the hospital. I started on a treatment therapy, and I relapsed on that drug. And the relapse was traumatic. The relapse was so significant that I had to go back to the ICU, go through the plasmapheresis process again. And then I was admitted into a rehabilitation facility where I had to learn how to walk again. So I went through the process of learning how to walk again. And I know we're short on time, so I'm just going to say this really quickly. Life after diagnosis has been, for me, just much about my prayer life. By the grace of God, I have recovered significantly, so much so that on the 3rd year anniversary, which was November of last year, of my diagnosis, I ran a marathon. I ran the New York City Marathon. And in managing NMO for me right now is just about community. It's about, connecting with people who really understand the disease, that you're able to speak the language, because unfortunately, you know, sometimes you try and explain it to family and they don't understand. And sometimes you would try to explain living with a chronic illness to people who've never been sick or ill before, and unfortunately, they don't understand. So I am glad that my neurologist encouraged me to join, to get connected with the Sumaira Foundation. I got connected with the Sumaira Foundation, found out that Sumaira and I are neighbors, so I can literally look out of my window and see her where she lives. And I also think that that was just another blessing in disguise as well. And so I am now an ambassador for the Sumaira Foundation. Advocacy has been something that I have just drawn more closely to. I was in Washington, D.C. A few weeks ago on Capitol Hill talking to our elected officials to gain support around policies that impact the rare disease community. And, you know, sometimes life, you know, happens in a very unique way. And so here I am. I know we're, you know, time has been a challenge for us today. So I want to pause there just so that we have an opportunity to have questions from each of you. But thank you for allowing me to share.
Oh my goodness, I'm almost in tears over here. Like, you guys are so, woo. I'm gonna take a moment. So inspiring. I thought I had finally gotten to the point where I was okay with, you know, having discussions like this without tearing up, but just being in spaces like this is awesome. So thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you all, everyone who's logged on, you know, for being here and coming to, you know, learn more and show support. But, you know, it's awesome to hear you all's story. And I appreciate you guys for sharing your story, for everything that you guys have, you know, what you've taken with your diagnosis and how you've incorporated it into your life to improve your life, but also, you know, others, you know, us living with MS and others living with NMO. So really, really appreciate you too. We have a little bit of time left, I believe, to just kind of have some discussion amongst ourselves, I believe. So I it's really interesting to me to hear kind of the similarities and the differences between kind of your stories in regards to your diagnosis, whether it was how quickly you were diagnosed, or, you know, that the fact that it needed a little bit more time, but then also kind of your experience just living with MS and NMO. So could you guys maybe discuss your similarities and differences that you may have noticed between your experiences with NMS and NMO?
I'll say I'm like on the verge of tears too, Dr. Nolan, because like woo, I love that the both of us, and you as well, you're an inspiration as, you know, a board certified neurologist. You're doing it, you know, that we didn't let our diagnoses affect like stop us, you know. We push through, you know. Marion's you know, she's speaking, she's advocating, she's talking to, you know, public officials who, you know, politicians who have a say in like our healthcare. So, and I've, you know, you saw what I have done, and I continue, you know, my advocacy through, you know, working with We Are Ill. I just love that, you know, these chronic illnesses tried to stop us, but and God, thank you, Jesus, for, you know, giving us this hope and just strength to persevere in spite of these challenges. So I'm just really grateful for all of everyone sharing their story. It's been really, I'm at a loss of words, but yeah.
Anything to include there, Marion?
No, so was your question around some of the similarities?
Yeah, how many similarities or differences that you've noticed between kind of the MS and NMO experience?
Yeah, so, you know, one of the things in terms of similarities, obviously, you know, when we go in for some of the neurological checks, you know, when I talk to, you know, fellow thrivers from the MS community, we talk about, you know, nerve pain, we talk about chronic fatigue, we talk about just some of the neuropathy challenges, some of the weaknesses we feel, you know, so how symptoms present, I think, is one of the things that we have in common. In terms of the differences, I think are how our relapses impact us. I know for NMO community, to have a relapse can be, I mean, it could set you back. I know when I had my relapse I was out of commission for an entire year. So I was almost bedridden for an entire year, relying on someone else to take care of me. I couldn't comb my hair. I had to go into rehabilitation and occupational therapy to really just get in the shower. I had to have a shower, seat, a bench to sit on. I couldn't stand. And so relapses, I know for us could be a traumatic game changer.
Absolutely. That's a key thing that I feel that I would want everyone to take away from today, that, regardless, it's devastating to be diagnosed with any kind of chronic condition, so whether it's NMO or MS, but I do think that it's important for us to be able to differentiate between the two and to realize that a lot of times the relapses that as you've explained, Marion, that you can see with NMO can be a lot more devastating in terms of the resolution of kind of those symptoms may not be as great or as prominent as what we would see with multiple sclerosis. So thank you for explaining that a little bit more. How has you all's understanding of your conditions evolved over time, and have you had any unexpected challenges or discoveries along the way?
I will say, I guess I'll tackle that first and then turn it over to Ashley to add. For me, how it's evolved over time, I'm always learning. Just being in the community with other individuals who are living with NMO, I'm always learning about new symptoms and how people are dealing with new symptoms. For a long time, I really didn't know that chronic fatigue was something associated with NMO. I just thought, man, I'm getting older, I'm really tired, and then I started to notice that, okay, I'm really tired. So I would get up in the morning and I would get ready for work. I'd shower, I get dressed, and I would be so exhausted from going through the process of doing something that I've been doing all my entire life. And then I noticed, okay, fatigue is, this is something that I need to figure out, how do I talk to my neurologist about this? So I'm always, reading, I'm always learning from others about the disease and how it presents, and, just figuring out new ways to, understand my body. So a lot of it is just listening to my body, because now everything that happens, I'm thinking, okay, is that something linked to NMO? And so just being very, very much in tune with my body, preparing for a marathon I was thinking, wait, am I really doing this after I just got diagnosed with NMO? But, you learn that only you live with your body. So, when things change, when something feels uncomfortable for you, when you've got to give yourself grace. And that's something that, we as individuals who live with autoimmune conditions, we have to give ourselves grace. We have to be patient with ourselves, and what I hear more and more is I find myself meeting lots of people who live with chronic conditions, and they are just ambitious people by nature. And so, just learning how to, find that balance is really important.
I'll just keep it short and say all the things that Marion said, but I think we just had our professional patient masterclass. So shout out to Victoria for coining that term. Like, you become a professional patient when you are diagnosed with a chronic illness, from managing all the appointments and just keeping track of all your symptoms. So I would say that we have graduated to become professional patients on our journey. So yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Absolutely. And I think maybe one additional question before we wrap up. Can you guys, share any tips for how you've been able to foster, and I realize that you may not have had this, every day or even now feel this way all the time, but able to foster a positive mindset or maintain the idea that you are resilient in this whole process, or the challenges that you guys have had with NMO and MS.
For me personally, I just take things one day at a time. If I start thinking about the what ifs and in the future, like what's going to happen, will a relapse come? I will be in shambles. So I literally just focus on what's in front of me. I praise God for, the activity of my limbs and just being healthy. And I celebrate the small wins, be it, being able to walk a full mile at Walk MS unassisted, or, even just like walking my dog around the block when it's like especially hot and I'm having heat intolerance. And I do go to therapy, talk with my therapist every other week, and that really helps me keep things into perspective. So that's just how I keep a positive mindset. Just a few ways.
Yeah. And I'll just add, for me, it's just, it's prayer for me. It's relying on my prayer circle. Shout out to Cornerstone, which is a group that, we pray together. They've been there through the very beginning of my diagnosis. I think another thing for me is just gratitude. When I look back at some of the pictures and video clips of me in the ICU, and I just, I'm like, thank you, Lord, for where you've brought me from, and, I know that things could be a lot worse for me today, but I'm able to get up and I'm independent. I gained my independence back. I remember there was a time when I couldn't drive, when I couldn't walk, when I couldn't run. And so I'm constantly just thinking of all the things that I have to be grateful for, including my support system. There's so many people in my life who love me, unconditionally, who are reaching out to take, to check on me, and so I just, I let that be kind of like the guiding light for me. And I'm an auntie. And so that's my, I love being a patient advocate. But my most important role in life is to be an aunt, is being an aunt right now. And so when I have my low days, I just get on FaceTime with my niece, and my 2-year-old niece, if she's not on YouTube, she'll spend some time with me on FaceTime. And so those are the things that, just help fill my cup. And so by the grace of God, I'm grateful to have that support in my life as well.
I love that. I love it. I agree. Same thing here for me. I have an 8-month-old, so a new mommy, and for the mothers out there, it's life changing. A different perspective on different things to kind of push forward with. But absolutely. Well, thank you all so much for this discussion here. I see a couple questions here. Will this recording be shared to attendings? I'm not sure if anyone else wanted to answer that question for them.
We are recording it, and we'll get it out to people somehow, some way.
Okay.
I see a quick question in the chat that I just wanted to answer. Someone asked, am I on medication? So yes, I actually am on biweekly infusions. So I'm in the hospital every other week, getting a treatment right now. The 2nd generation drug to the treatment that I'm on now, we're waiting on FDA approval. When the FDA approves that, and if I decide to switch to their drug, which I'm praying on that, but I think I will, if it kind of makes sense for me, I'll be receiving treatment every 8 weeks as opposed to every other week. And then I take, I have a collection of medications that I take daily for nerve pain, for fatigue, for a couple of other things. But I'm on Instagram, so if I'm not able to answer everything on here, feel free to, reach out to me, and I'm happy to share more information. I'm also on the Sumaira Foundation's website, so you can find my email through that foundation as well.
Perfect. And I see, Ashley, you shared your email and Instagram and your company Instagram in the chat. I'm learning to get better on Instagram. I do have an Instagram. I'm not the best on it, but I do have one, my Instagram, and I'll put that in the chat as well. But it's JA_K16. All right.
I guess I can just come on and say thank you to everybody who joined us today. Thank you to our amazing panelists. The stories were amazing. A lot of good information, and happy MS and NMOSD Awareness Month.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you
so much.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.